call this one the kick pusher. So the interesting thing with this, it's a pretty simple groove, but the tricky thing that a lot of drummers have on the drums is trying to separate the hi-hat and the bass drum out. So this groove is just another one that it's another placement which people tend to struggle with. So we're going to start with a bass drum and a hi-hat together, followed by a hi-hat on its own, then a snare drum and a hi-hat. That's the easier bit. So bass and snare, bass and snare. But after that last snare there, we're then going to straight away, very quickly, put in another bass drum. So after you play the snare and hi-hat, a bass drum on its own. So both hands together, then a bass drum down on the floor. So bass and snare, bass, straight in there. Bass and snare, bass. And then to finish it off, another bass drum and a hi-hat. And that finishes off the phrase, but makes it quite tricky towards the end of the measure there. So bass and snare, bass, bass and hat. Bass and snare, bass, bass and hat. So straight in, the last three notes, snare and hat, bass drum on its own, bass drum and hat together. Snare, bass, bass and hat. And that's the tricky little biscuit that people tend to struggle with when they try and get it in their grooves, because the bass drum is on its own. You're kind of pushing straight out of the snare drum. So bass and snare, bass, bass and hat. And as you then speed that up, you want to keep that hi-hat always ticking along. Don't let it slow down. And bass and snare, bass, bass. Let's try it again. Bass, snare, bass, bass. And then when you get to the end, obviously it's finishing on that bass, a bass and a hi-hat together. So when you then repeat it and do it again, as you start, you're starting with a bass drum and a hi-hat, and you're finishing with a bass drum and a hi-hat, meaning that it actually kind of rolls on again and again. So bass and snare, bass, bass and hat together, bass and hat together, as it repeats. Bass, snare, bass, 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 snare, bass, 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 snare, bass, bass. And as you speed it up, it starts to sound pretty cool. But it's that kind of placement of the kicks that people struggle with, and you might be able to get it, but then you might find your hi-hats getting interrupted. You got bass and snare, bass, 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 and snare, bass, so your hi-hat starts going a little bit sporadic because of how the bass drum is affecting it. So the ultimate goal is to keep that right hand ticking away nicely. See, you're getting a pretty cool groove there. So it doesn't look that complicated, kind of written down, but it's yeah, it's a funny one to try and get the coordination, the way your right hand and your right foot play together. It's not nice. Anyway, I'm Dex. If you guys would like drum lessons, please get in touch with me. I do it over Zoom, so it doesn't matter where you are in the world. We can get together. And then for everything else, check out Drumdex.